Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Fox, and I'm a PhD candidate in Communication Science Studies and Critical Gender Studies at the University of California, San Diego. This presentation is called Hypothesizing Medicine as the Primary Source of Weight Stigma, Introducing the Medical Devaluation Model. And it's the first of three presentations in our session, Medicine, Structural Stigma, and Pathologization, a new approach towards studying and fighting weight stigma. I wanted to start this presentation with a question. Where does weight stigma come from in today's world? Why do fat people continue to be so profoundly devalued, even as awareness of weight stigma increases? If you ask the weight stigma literature, the field has been giving the same singular answer for 30 years, attribution theory. Attribution theory posits that weight stigma results from individuals misunderstanding that weight is not under individual control. This quote from a deeply fatphobic 2020 international consensus statement about the stigma of obesity says, when individuals attribute the causes of obesity primarily to internal controllable factors or personal choices, they exhibit higher weight bias. Now, there are two main problems with attribution theory. One is that it basically says fat people are bad, but it's not their fault, which is still stigmatizing, as I'll explain through the rest of this presentation. But the other is that it doesn't account for why individuals care about people being fat in the first place. The question of who or what is to blame for someone being fat already assumes that being fat is bad and someone or something must be to blame for it. Therefore, attribution theory is an incomplete explanation for why weight stigma continues to exist. In recent years, some researchers have tried to apply different models beyond attribution theory to better explain why weight stigma exists. For example, some scholars have argued for an attribution value model, which incorporates broader cultural values as a source of stigma. However, beyond proposing that they exist, these articles often leave cultural values unexplained. In this article, Brochu suggests that framing fatness as a public health crisis might perpetuate the negative valuation of fat people, but her theory does not explain the link between negative cultural values and public health claims. In a similar vein, Calligaro et al. Proposed that weight stigma emerges from structures that generate and legitimize anti-fat ideologies, such as myths about the connection between weight and health, but they do not explain what those structures are or how ideologies linking weight, disease, and health actually work at the psychological level to stigmatize fat people. I want to be clear that these studies are definitely a step in the right direction for the field of weight stigma. However, they don't propose an alternative theory to explain where weight stigma comes from today and how it works as a result. And although scholars such as Sabrina Strings and Amy Erdman-Farrell have traced the origins of anti-fatness historically, there's no theory that links contemporary sources of anti-fatness to the social psychological processes involved in stigmatizing beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. But if you ask any fat activist why fat people are devalued, one of the answers you'll get is because people think we're unhealthy. For example, if you read the comments on any article or Instagram post about body positivity, they're almost guaranteed to be full of people saying things like, this is glorifying obesity, or this is bad because it tells people it's okay to be unhealthy. The reason fat people experience anti-fat oppression is not just because people blame us for being fat. It's because there's a whole apparatus dedicated to making claims about our ill health and all its inevitable consequences and circulating those claims to the entire society. In other words, medicine itself as an institution, a body of knowledge, and a set of practices and practitioners devalues fat people and trains anyone who comes into contact with medical knowledge about fatness, aka anything about obesity, to also devalue fat people. The field of weight stigma doesn't have any language or concepts to describe this phenomenon, so we're calling it the medical devaluation model of weight stigma. We hypothesize that the medical devaluation of fatness produces weight stigma through a series of steps. First, medical labeling transforms fatness from a bodily state to a pathological condition in need of medical intervention and/or prevention. So the disease category of obesity itself marks fatness as undesirable and bad. Next, over the last several decades, an overwhelming tide of medical claims that define fatness as pathological and the cause of many negative health effects have circulated widely within medicine, the broader media, and even within weight stigma research. At the cultural level, these medical claims legitimize the devaluation of fat people. They provide scientific authority for the assumption that fat people are bad and should not exist. And at the social psychological level, individuals exposed to negative medical claims about fatness internalize a set of medical beliefs about fatness and a sort of medical mentality towards fat people. Said more simply, the decades-long constant message that fat people are pathological burdens who will bring about the downfall of humanity might have something to do with our mistreatment. As part of this model, we have hypothesized some potential social psychological mechanisms by which internalized medical claims about obesity may lead to prejudice against fat people. Prejudice may emerge from individuals stereotyping all fat people as diseased. It's very common to learn that all fat people are diseased and/or at high risk of disease. And because disease is a negative characteristic, individuals who think fat people are diseased may judge them negatively. That might look like seeing a fat coworker and immediately thinking about how much money they're costing you from increased healthcare usage. Alternatively, the mechanism could be dehumanizing fat people. When an individual who has internalized medical claims about obesity perceives a fat person, medical information about obesity or medical ways of viewing fat bodies may override their perception of that fat person as a unique individual person. For example, you could see a person across the street and all you think about is whether they are obese because of a genetic mutation or food deserts. Alternatively, you could watch a televised bariatric surgery on reality TV, and then the next time you see a fat person, you think about cutting out part of their stomach. Many of us are familiar with this comic where a doctor recommends weight loss for someone impaled by a branch. I would argue this can actually be considered an example of dehumanization because in this encounter, medical information about obesity is overriding the usual cognitive processes of clinical decision-making, leading this doctor to focus on weight over a lethal injury. The doctor isn't seeing an individual, he's seeing obesity. A third possible mechanism is the activation of a treatment goal. So when individuals internalize medical guidance about obesity, they may develop a routinized link between fatness and the imperative to lose weight. That could look like an individual making small talk with a new colleague who is fat and without prompting, recommending that they try the keto diet. Routinized link between fatness and the imperative to lose weight. Finally, it's possible that internalizing a disease stereotype of obesity could lead to the activation of an evolutionary module designed for avoiding infection and contagion. That might play out as seeing an individual seeing a fat person sitting in the front of the bus and walking all the way to the back to avoid sitting near them. And again, any of these mechanisms are possible. We don't have the evidence to substantiate any particular mechanism yet, because these are hypotheses for future research. To summarize, we're proposing that the medical devaluation model involves medicine generating devaluing claims, which then circulate widely. Individuals then internalize those devaluing medical claims and judge fat people negatively as a result. Note, this could include internal judgments, could be fat people making negative judgments about themselves. And finally, those negative judgments lead individuals to take stigmatizing actions. In this model, stigmatizing actions might include a classic example, not hiring someone because you think they'll take too many days off. But they also include actions that have yet to be recognized as stigmatizing, such as a nurse or a friend suggesting that you lose weight and recommending you try out Weight Watchers. Stigmatizing actions can also look like developing a public health campaign about the dangers of obesity, a journalist interviewing obesity doctors as the experts when writing a story about fat lives, putting up a flyer encouraging people to take the stairs because it will help them lose weight. It can even look like posting on social media about your weight loss journey. In this model, any action that reduces the value of fatness is stigmatizing, especially if it's justified via medical information. So obviously this model has big implications for the field of weight stigma research. Most immediately, weight stigma researchers need to divest from a pathologized model of fatness. Relying on anything about obesity contributes to devaluation. And this is especially significant for attribution theory interventions, almost all of which reinforce the idea of obesity as a disease through attempts to change etiological thinking. I would argue that this intervention does more harm than good, or this kind of intervention, because they train intervention participants to believe that they are somehow reducing stigma while continuing to devalue fat people. The medical model of fatness, obesity, is not neutral, it's not objective, it's not inevitable. And weight stigma research treating it as such contributes to the medical devaluation of fat people. There's no hard boundary between social attitudes and medical claims. Medical information shapes the kinds of phenomena social psychology investigates. Not recognizing this has limited weight stigma research to studying things downstream from initial medical devaluation, such as attribution. And it has also enabled the field to contribute to weight stigma. Following this model, making fatness more medical or making obesity a more legitimate disease, which is the focus of a bunch of weight stigma campaigns right now, is going to increase the devaluation of fat people, which is going to increase weight stigma. These campaigns are really dangerous. And this also includes the linguistic shift that these groups are pushing from person identity first to person first language. And the thing is, calling someone an obese person and a person with obesity, those are both stigmatizing. Second, the field of weight stigma research needs to measure outcomes that make a concrete difference for fat people's lives. Researchers can no longer measure controllability beliefs and claim they're reducing stigma when the beliefs they're measuring uphold medical devaluation. We need to measure behaviors, or at the very least, behavioral intentions. And this also means that statistical significance is not enough. We need interventions with practically significant impacts. Additionally, researchers should return to studying the basic social cognitive mechanisms underlying weight stigma. This means looking for new mediators of weight stigma beyond attributions that center on the internalization of a medical mentality towards fatness. Some ideas are included on this slide. I'm not going to go through them in the interest of time, but they're here for those of you who are interested. And finally, the only solution to the medical devaluation of fat people is valuing us. There's no middle ground or cheat code to somehow reduce stigma while continuing to devalue fat people. The goal of weight stigma research should be the eventual creation of a world without stigma, which means that weight stigma research should treat fat people the way that fat people would be treated in a world without weight stigma. Researchers can't in one breath say stigma is bad, and in the next say the world would be so much better off without fat people, and hope that it somehow makes a difference. And again, removing blame for being fat doesn't change the imperative to intervene in fatness, which is pretty obvious when you see articles like this appearing in the New York Times. Changing blame is not the same as valuing fat people. I wanted to end with two things. First, this quote from the president and CEO of the Obesity Action Coalition, a group that is currently running a Stop Weight Bias campaign, who is apparently baffled as to how efforts to make obesity bad made the people with obesity bad. The medical devaluation model solved this mystery. The efforts to make obesity bad made the people with obesity bad. And finally, as fat activist Marilyn Wan phrases it, there is no nice, unstigmatizing way to wish that fat people did not exist. And this is a pretty good standard by which to evaluate if something is contributing to the devaluation of fat people. Thank you so much for listening. I have a summary of my talk here in case anyone's looking for it. And here is where you can find me. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from some of you. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Fox, and I'm a PhD candidate in Communication Science Studies and Critical Gender Studies at the University of California, San Diego. This presentation is called Hypothesizing Medicine as the Primary Source of Weight Stigma, Introducing the Medical Devaluation Model. And it's the first of three presentations in our session, Medicine, Structural Stigma, and Pathologization, a new approach towards studying and fighting weight stigma.